You talked a lot about infrastructure and reconciliation tonight. I wanted to ask you, ahead of Senate Democrats announcing their 3.5 trillion proposal, progressives in the House specifically were calling for a 6 trillion price tag. I'm wondering if you can characterize, how you feel about the budget resolution that was announced earlier this week, given that it's less than what progressives wanted, and just kind of how you're framing, what you see in the budget resolution. Do you view it potentially as a loss for progressives?
Well, so I think there's a couple of things about breaking down these numbers, right? Because we hear 6 trillion here, 3.5 trillion there, and what do these numbers mean, et cetera. And one of the things that I don't think is kind of given enough attention is the fact that a lot of these figures, particularly the lower figures like the 3.5, it is not, they're not always reflective of the full spend of the bill because they include the offsets or the pay-fors. And so it's a 3.5 trillion outlay investment. But a lot of times the overall investment, the amount that we're actually putting out there and investing in infrastructure is much higher than 3.5 trillion. And then you bring it back by the pay-fors, which get you to, about 3.5 trillion. And so all that being said, we did want even more, of course. We want that outlay. We would like that outlay to be 6 trillion so that we're spending, ideally 10, having that 10 trillion and then having potentially those outlays that bring us back to a 6 trillion point. 10 trillion is also the number that we wanted to get for a Green New Deal. Now, the fact that we're at 3.5 trillion, though, doesn't mean that that's the entirety of investment. And so, because there are some of those offsets and outlays there. And so I think that this is an enormous victory. First of all, this bill is absolutely a progressive victory, because if it wasn't for progressives in the House, we probably would be stuck with that tiny, pathetic bipartisan bill alone, and that would have been the entirety of our infrastructure spending. And so compared to the bipartisan package, which is what 1.7, I believe, compared to the very small number of the bipartisan infrastructure package, what House progressives have been able to do is have a much larger bill. The reconciliation bill is larger than the bipartisan bill, and it contains progressive priorities. It is led and spearheaded by progressive priorities. And frankly, it's much larger than I believe even the Biden administration would have come into alone without the progressive momentum built for big infrastructure spending. And so is it the Green New Deal in its entirety with a $10 trillion investment, 4 trillion in outlays, and rather 4 trillion in revenue raisers, taxing the rich, corporations, et cetera, and 6 trillion? Okay, no, but cut me some slack. I'm just after my first term. But I do think that I think this is absolutely a progressive victory. We've got we have universal childcare. We have the first establishment of the Civilian Climate Corps, which is the first time in almost 100 years, or perhaps like 80 years or so, since 1938, the first revitalization of the Conservation Corps with an expansion of its mandate. So this is not just about building trails in our national parks. This is about weatherizing people's homes for climate disaster. This is about putting solar panels on people's roofs. This is about beautifying neighborhoods and really working with communities like ours with high childhood asthma rates. And this is about essentially creating a universal basic income program for children. And so I think we've won. None of that would have happened without the Progressive Caucus, I think. I think that if it wasn't for House progressives, even if we still had 3.5 trillion in spending, a lot of it would be in, frankly, carbon producing investments like roads and bridges alone. I don't think we would have the care infrastructure in this in this bill, and I think we would have gotten a lot more car infrastructure and much less public transit investment on the level that we need. And so this is 3.5 trillion in progressive spending. That's what I think is really important too. It's a 3.5 trillion package around progressive priorities. So it's not just the price tag, it's what we're spending on. And progressives, I would say, if I can, not be humble for a moment, I think we've run the board in determining the priorities of our spending.